Okay, welcome to this week's episode of KUDEN. So, quick question. Have you ever had the experience of going back to something, right? Technique, who knows, right? That you thought you knew, only to find out that you missed something entirely, right? Or you saw things you completely missed the first, second, 10th time, that kind of thing, right? And again, maybe it was a book you first read 20 years ago. Maybe it was a conversation with a parent or a friend. Maybe it was a lesson from one of your teachers, right? Or maybe it was a technique, right? You've practiced, I'm going to exaggerate, right? 1,000 times. And then you saw it, right? Something clicked, right? Now, nothing changed about what was there, right? The words didn't change in the book, right? The technique didn't change. The kata didn't change. You did, right? You saw something different, but it had always been there, right? And one of the things that has fascinated, I guess is a good word, one of the things that's fascinated me over my more than 5 decades of martial arts training, 45 of those are in Ninjutsu, and especially during the years with training Hatsumi Sensei, other master teachers here and in Japan. What has fascinated me is how often students, myself included, right, of course, right, would walk away from a class saying, "I've seen that before," or "Sensei's teaching the same thing again." Right? But was he, right? Or was he using the same model, right? Something that everybody was familiar with, so you could shorten the learning curve in that direction, right? Was he using the same model to expose or reveal or show a lesson that we simply weren't capable of seeing the last, I don't know how many times before now, right? So I think one of the biggest mistakes that we as martial artists make is confusing familiarity with understanding. Just talking with a couple of students during class tonight that, we can say that we understand something because we've seen it, we've done it, that kind of thing, right? But there's a huge difference between those two things, right? Being familiar with something and actually understanding it, right? We recognize the movement. We know the name of the kata. We've passed the test, right? We've earned the rank. And somewhere, almost without realizing it, we stop looking. We become certain. And certainty is not a bad thing, but certainty has an interesting effect. Certainty quietly, subtly, unconsciously replaces curiosity. And now that may not sound like a problem at first, right? After all, we learned the technique, right? Until you realize that curiosity is what allows us to continue seeing. It keeps us looking. It keeps us exploring, trying to figure things out, to understand. Yeah. Okay. And when curiosity disappears, development often stops long before physical training does, right? Or perhaps training itself eventually stops because we unknowingly concluded that there was nothing more to discover, right? That we had figured it out. We know this stuff. Maybe, right? You've heard the lines. I know I have, right? Life got busy. Work demanded more time. The kids needed attention. My spouse wasn't supportive. Yes, we've all heard them, right? And those things absolutely happen. said, here's a question I've been wrestling with lately. And I've used this in class, right? We're covering something with a certain technique, and, you know, we're trying to look at the principles of distance and angling, right? And so the student moves to a position and takes up, let's say, Ichimonji no Kamae. And I say, what if your arm wasn't there? What if your lead arm wasn't there, right? Drop your arm. Are you still as safe, right? Or is there still safety, right? Can he reach you now that the arm's not there? Okay. And that's what we mean by principles, right? If the form goes away and things still function, then everything is good, right? So here's the question when it comes to all those life things that get in people's way, right? The question I have for students or people when they say that, you know, well, I quit or I got away from training because XYZ happened, whatever, right? My new thing is I say, if none of those things had happened, would you still be training? Would you still be training today? Right? And if the honest answer is, I'm not sure, then perhaps those circumstances weren't the real reason that someone stopped. Perhaps they were just the thing that simply gave that person permission to walk away from something that they had already begun believing that they understood, or it was optional, or whatever the reasoning was, right? And that's a difficult question. It's certainly not comfortable, right? But real growth rarely begins inside our comfort zone. We've talked about this lots in the past, right? And that's the truly hard part, right? Fighting against that damn comfort zone, against easy, right? So today's episode begins with one of the most misunderstood principles in all of Ninjutsu. Okay? It's a principle surrounded by stories of deceptions, disguises, theatrical arts, misdirection, right? Ninja tricks. And historically, all those things are absolutely true, right? The ninja studied them, they practiced them, they depended on them. But what if those things were never the real lesson? What if they were simply the first lesson? Okay? And what if the greatest deception wasn't the one used against an attacker, but something altogether different? Related, but different. Okay? So during this episode, we are exploring the ninja's Kyojitsu Tenkan, right? Juxtapositioning or altering truth and falsehood. Okay? And my focus is to go beyond the tricks, to go beyond deception, right? That surface level stuff. Because hidden inside every trick, right, is a lesson about other things. Ultimately, it's a lesson about human nature, right? And hidden inside that lesson, right, may be the reason some martial artists continue growing for a lifetime, while others unknowingly stop seeing, stop exploring, long before they stop physically coming to a class. Okay, so that's what we're going to dive into, and yeah, we'll see what happens. So I'll see you when we get back.
So, the big question is this: how are self-defense and success-minded people like us, concerned citizens worried about protecting ourselves, our loved ones, and the things we care about from the monsters we know exist in the world? How do we train in a way that gives us the skills, knowledge, and understanding we need without becoming paranoid fighters or killers ourselves, and yet still allows us to be the hero protector the world needs us to be? That's the question, and this podcast will give you the answers. My name is Jeffrey Miller, and welcome to KUDEN Radio, real training for real people in a real world.
All right. James, did that come across okay? Seems to have glitched on my side just a little bit.
It was all good.
Okay, awesome. Just want to make sure we don't have some weird tech issues. Not that we can do anything about them except fix them on the fly, right? Because What do I always say? Technology is great when it works.
When it works.
Right? Pretty much like people. Expecting technology to be perfect when it was built by people. Anyway, so. But Sensei, it was built by perfect people. I know, everybody thinks they're perfect, which is what makes everybody average. Anyway, all right, so got a lot to get into during this one. Who is on? Who's here already?
So far, it's just Alan, Kyle, and Jared who's checked in.
Okay, awesome. All right, well, welcome, guys. All right, so let me bring up my notes here, and we are going to jump in. So, am I in the right place? I hope so. Yes. All right. All right. So, all right. This is, for people keeping track, this is episode 313. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because I know I did a kind of a formal series. I don't know, somewhere around what? The early 300s. I mean, I technically was telling the early 300s. But there was a series, was a 3-part series, James, I think. But there's been kind of an ongoing thing here, probably since episode 309, definitely 310. And I started something, and it's carried over into classes and whatnot. It might have even started in class, where I needed to get students to stop stopping when it comes to techniques, right? To stop seeing lower rank level techniques as being something that they had already done, they already learned, and they've already gone beyond, right? Those things are beneath me now because my rank is this, okay? I think I've been mentioning things like this since I got back from this trip to Japan, and reminded everyone that Ninjutsu Sensei, Nagato Sensei, right? These new Soke and these other master teachers and whatnot are still talking about continuing to explore the Kyonopo and the Sanshin, right? And the Sampo Gata. While everybody else is running around, like they already got that shit down pat. I mean, what could there still be to explore, especially when you've been training, with Hatsumi Sensei since you were 13 or you were 17? Or why the hell are you still looking at these same things, right? So for several weeks now, at least a couple of weeks, and for several more moving forward, I have been leading students at the dojo, my advanced program students and whatnot, through different subjects, right? Omote Gyaku, this monitoring hand kind of thing that people think is a optional step in the models for Omote Gyaku, Hon Gyaku, a bunch of things. Right? And we've been looking at what's the take, what's the perspective, what's the focus, right, on this thing from a beginner's level. What is right and appropriate there, right? Because a lot of people they tend to think that and a lot of martial arts are done this way, but beginners get the easy stuff, and then the next level up gets some stuff that's a little bit more complicated, then the next one a little bit more complicated. So it's a matter of complexity, and then mastery equals look at how much I know, and look at I can do a 46 move or a 46 step string kata for who knows, 6 dan, whatever, right? But that's not been my experience in this art. So if it's not a matter of that, and if we're looking at advanced level people, and it seems like they're doing stuff that's like way easier and it's simpler, well, then it can't be a matter of complexity, right? So that brings us back to, right, if this is what it looks like for a beginner, then what does it look like at different stages for the developing student, right? What are they able to see? What are they looking for out of the same technique, right? More control, more options, more abilities, right? Then we get to this advanced level. And often the view is not the same. It's not like we're getting more control and we're getting more options or whatever. It's we're getting greater capability. And if we can see all of them, beginner level, intermediate level, advanced level, senior level, Tatsujin level, all as having layers and layers of capabilities, right? There's more they can do with the same thing, right? Not more options, not more henka, right? And so I thought, what if we do this with a principle? What if we do this with something that people think is a part of techniques, it's a part of Ninpo, it's a part of Ninjutsu, but it's seen in a very limited way, right? And how does that change and how does that grow? How does that, it doesn't shift and change. It looks, and this is the thing, it looks like it shifts and changes, but it doesn't, because the advanced person still has the same capabilities. Like they can do all the stuff that an intermediate student can do. Options, control factors, those kind of things. Take the Gyakute, right? So can they steer them into the ground? Can they, all that stuff, of course, right? Can they do the same thing with like pain compliance and whatnot that a beginner would be focused on? Yeah, okay. But now it's contextual, right? They're not just stuck on that technique being for this thing, or they're not stuck on looking for or relying on pain compliance, or the technique doesn't even have to take the person to the ground, right? It can be used momentarily to set up something else. Okay, it can be used as a deception, and then things change, right? And so the interesting thing is that very often it's not a matter of knowing more and having more like techniques and things like that, right? It's a matter of having more capabilities with fewer, but that doesn't mean that you have less, right? So anyway, today we're going to explore, to me, right, one of the most fascinating, and I believe, again, I mentioned this in the monologue before the intro, right? One of the most misunderstood principles in all of Ninpo and all of Bujinkan arts, and that is Kyojitsu Tenkan Ho, right? Now, if you've been around the Bujinkan for any length of time, you've almost certainly heard that phrase, okay? If you haven't, right, don't worry about it, right? You'll catch up really quickly here, right? But you've probably heard it translated as the interchange of truth and falsehood, right? You've probably heard it as the strategy of truth and deception, a whole bunch of different ways, right? Japanese is specifically, it's not vague, it's very specific, but the same thing can be said many different ways, right? But also Japanese concepts, words for certain concepts don't often translate cleanly into English like other languages, other European languages might do, okay? But either way, right? If you've been around for a while, even if you've just been following Ninjutsu and you're a fan, right? You may have heard stories about ninja disguises, false identities, misdirection, even the theatrical arts within the Togakude school, right? Distractions, feints, I don't know, making your opponent believe one thing while you do something else, right? And historically, right, all those things are absolutely part of the tradition, right? In fact, if we look at the Togakude view and the broader ninja traditions, we find lessons in disguise, performance, acting, creating false impressions, manipulating expectations, right? Disappearing into crowds, changing identities, every conceivable method of increasing the odds of survival in a hostile environment, right? Those things are real, right? They belong to the art. Right? We're going to need to talk about that a little bit because that can rub some people the wrong way, right? I think it's also one of the reasons why things got compressed into we're only doing taijutsu. We're not doing this other part because it doesn't fit today's world or whatever. Okay. But I think it's a mistake when modern practitioners become uncomfortable with those historical realities and then try to explain them away, or worse yet, try to ignore them, right? Or drop them from the training altogether, right? Because they aren't realistic for modern self-defense, right? Or they seem to be cheating, right? And these people only do fair fights, right? Seem to be the thing of ninja movie stuff, right? Or anybody learns that stuff, right? The only reason that stuff is around is for breaking the law or things like that, right? But if we actually study, dive deeper into the history, not just the techniques, right? The ninja themselves, who weren't even called ninja when this stuff was organized, right, weren't studying these things because they wanted to entertain people. They weren't studying them to look cool, to be ninja, right? They weren't studying them because they were criminally minded. Okay? Once the Chukai is full of these things, right? They studied them because survival sometimes requires them, right? If creating a distraction meant escaping a castle or, an ambush or whatever alive, then you created the distraction, right? If disguising yourself meant completing the mission and returning safely to your family, you wore a damn disguise. Right? If misleading someone prevented a fight altogether, that was often the better outcome, right? That's what you did. Okay, so let's begin this exploration into something that some people just can't get away from. I know I had a problem in the very, very beginning, seeing this stuff as anything other than deception and cheating and those kind of things, and it was a punch to the identity, right? But like most people who grow and develop, not just in this art, but in a well-rounded way in the world, right? They get over themselves, and that's what I had to do. Okay, so but let's begin by acknowledging something honestly, okay? And that is that yes, Kyojitsu Tenkan Ho begins with deception. Okay, it begins with overt examples that even a beginner can understand. Right? You feint high and you strike low. Right? You look left and then you move right, or you look left while you're moving right. Right? You retreat and then suddenly re-enter. Right? All kinds of things. Right? Create a distraction over here while your real objective is somewhere else. Right? These are legitimate lessons. Okay? They're where we begin. Okay? But here's the question I'd like you to think about today. What makes any of those things work? Not how do I perform the trick? Right? What do I do to distract him so I can do this other thing, right? That's a beginner question. It's not a wrong question. It's not a bad question. Okay? But there's a different question. It's not how do I perform the trick, it's why does the trick work at all? Okay? Think about that for a minute. Okay? If deception alone was enough, then it should work on everyone, every time, against every opponent. But we know that's not true. Right? Some people fall for it. Some don't. Some attackers chase distractions like right away. And others, they don't even react. Okay? Why? What's the difference? Okay? And perhaps even more importantly, if we answer that question, have we actually learned something much deeper than another trick? Because I don't think the theatrical arts were really teaching deception. I think deception was the teaching model, right? It was the overt appearance of something that's going on that if we could explore it more deeply, then we wouldn't have to rely on whether or not they saw it or not. What if we didn't have to do the magician's misdirection, hoping we caught their attention, hoping we caught it long enough to get our punch or technique or whatever into play, right? What if we didn't have to do that? Now, again, we have to start somewhere, okay? But I'm speaking about this from a very specific level, a very specific phase in my own training and development, okay? And later I'll show you, I think I have an example where we're not stacking things on. This isn't like I traded something out for this perspective. Okay. As a matter of fact, I think it was Saturday morning, had a couple of intermediate students in class and then a couple of advanced students in class. And I pulled out a technique from our Mod 1, our white to yellow belt training, and looked at it from a very high level. Nothing changed about the technique. Okay. As a matter of fact, I made the technique more difficult to do. We'll get to that later. All right. So again, I think deception was the teaching model, right? Just like Koku isn't really teaching uke nagashi and kick parrying, right? Just as Ichimonji isn't really teaching you where to put your lead hand. Just the beginner's wrist escape isn't ultimately about escaping a wrist grab. Okay. Are you escaping a wrist grab? Yeah. Right. Are you putting your lead hand someplace in his face or somewhere on his body? Yeah. Right. In the model Koku, right? Is there typically an uke nagashi and a kick parry? Yeah. Okay. So I'm not saying those things aren't there. What I'm saying is that model might be teaching us something else. Okay. Those are the large, obvious models. But as Hatsumi Sensei said, the place to start, right? It's the doorway. So again, they are self-defense options for sure, right? But they're also the place where we begin seeing something that would otherwise remain invisible, right? If the beginner technique was all we ever looked at. Yeah? And I believe that's exactly what's happening with Kyojitsu Tenkan Ho. The overt trick, right, isn't the destination. It's not the whole lesson. Okay. One of the lessons that Hatsumi Sensei repeated a lot was that Kyojitsu Tenkan Ho is in every technique. It's in everything that we do. But that doesn't mean that like we're running around playing April Fool's tricks on people and pranking people and whatever, right? You imagine we're doing it all the time. So I'm doing it while I'm eating dinner. I'm doing it while I'm hugging my wife. Well, either I'm a hell of a con man or I'm a sociopath or I don't think that's it, right? So what I'm getting to here is that the overt trick, right? The deception, the distraction that people can see in the beginning that they're actually looking for, right? Oh, cool trick, right? It's not the destination. It's not the end point. It's not the whole lesson. It's the first lesson. Okay. The deeper lesson, it's been there from the beginning. Well, let me say this. I'm going to change that. The deeper lessons have been there from the very beginning. Right? Most of us, including me at one time, simply weren't capable of seeing it yet. Okay? And that's where I'd like to begin our journey, our study, our exploration during this episode, right? Not by asking, how do I deceive another person, right? But by asking a much more important question. I think it's more important anyway, right? And that question is, what's the lesson hidden inside the distraction, inside the trick, inside the whatever it is, right? Inside the Kyojitsu, right? So let's explore that. Okay. But as usual, James, anybody else check in? Any questions? Any comments?
Just a Daoud over on Facebook and FSM Tower over on YouTube checked in. They're saying you're
You got like CIA code people, or
maybe. But,
oh, okay, fair enough.
Looks like a couple people said your audios went out of sync with the video a few times, but it's not broken up at all. It's just but it's still coming through clear. So.
Yeah, I'm sort of worried about it. I was having some video issues earlier, and I restarted my computer and everything, and I apologize. Most of you will get it on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all that kind of stuff later, so you're not going to notice. But for those of you who are trying to watch the dancing monkey not dance, I apologize if there's any audio glitches. All right. Anything else?
No, sir.
All right. Actually, before I just continue this deep dive into Kyojitsu, just a quick reminder: save the date. I think it was an episode or two ago. I let everybody know I was going to be working on setting the dates for our upcoming fall camp intensive. Again, if you're listening to this in our future, right? If you're listening to this past October of 2026, ignore it, right? Because you will have missed it, unless we somehow have the camp videos available or something like that. Okay. But for those of you who are in real time or you're close to that, right? I'm jazzed to officially announce the dates for this year's fall camp intensive. Right? It's one of our 3 big events that we do every year, spring, fall, and our New Year's Daikomyosai. I have the dates for that as well. Just don't have a theme set for it yet. So I'll hold announcing that one for another episode or two. But October 16th, 17th, and 18th, obviously 2026, right? We are doing our fall camp intensive. And the theme this year is the hidden lessons of the katana. Okay? And what we're going to be focusing on is discovering these timeless principles that are both in the use of the katana, right, the Japanese sword, but also they're universal, right? Principles that we can extract, right, that we can take from sword training that literally transform how we see and how we use every weapon, every technique, and every encounter. Okay. Like I said, I'll go into it more when I get the page up and whatnot. But the quick of it here is that most people think of the katana as simply another weapon, right? I mean, it's a cool weapon. You get my vote, right? But these Japanese martial traditions saw it as something much more, right? And again, here's another one of those things where, like, sensei, it's a weapon. Yeah, it's a weapon. What else? Okay. Because for generations, right, the sword served as one of the greatest teachers of distance, timing, initiative, commitment, adaptability. Should I go on? Precision, the ability to make the right decision where there may only be one opportunity to do so. Okay. Think about unarmed fights in today's world. I don't care if they're sport fights, the fight on the street corner, whatever. Okay. How many times can somebody get hit in the friggin' head or on the body or whatever before it actually starts seriously affecting them? Okay. I know there's knockout shots and all that kind of stuff, right? But when a blade's involved, especially a 36-inch razor blade, you make a mistake, that's it, right? There are instantaneous consequences. So since we've been exploring this idea, this concept, right, that in a warrior protector's training curriculum, every technique, every skill must earn its place there, right? What problem does it solve? Not just just learn it, dude. It's a part of the tradition. No. And I'm not knocking tradition. I'm not knocking history. I'm not knocking it. What problem does it solve? And then that begs the question: is that problem big enough, important enough to spend the finite amount of time, effort, energy, attention, all that, right, on getting good at it? Is the return on investment worth everything it's going to have to go into learning it? Okay. And I'm not knocking lineage, history, anything like that. Right? I think this is what's behind a lot of people trying to modernize ninjutsu, right? Trying to make modern ninjutsu and whatever. And I'm not knocking that kind of stuff either. But I think a lot of attempts at modernizing it are coming from the perspective of what it looks like and what modern combat looks like, or what modern problems look like. And so we still have this surface value judgment going on rather than the principles and concepts. Okay. So we're not training in sword because we're going to be carrying swords. It'll be the weapon of choice. No. Right? I think the sword can teach a lot. Okay. And as Hatsumi Sensei has often reminded us, in a real attack, anything is possible. So you need to be able to use weapons. Okay. But that also points to that a warrior protector cannot afford to become attached to a single weapon or a single method. Right? We don't have the luxury of favorites. We don't have the luxury of having a good side and a bad side. Right? I know ego wants it to be that way, but that's not the way it works. Right? Instead, we have to learn the timeless principles, right, that allow us to adapt for whatever happens, for however it unfolds. Okay? So this year's fall camp is not about becoming a swordsman, right? We will have an upcoming course on that for anybody that's interested, but it's not about becoming a swordsman. Okay? The theme for this camp is it's about discovering these universal lessons, these principles, right, that the sword has preserved for centuries. Okay? Lessons that you can't miss, right? Lessons that reveal themselves in taijutsu, in every traditional weapon, modern weapon, in modern self-protection, okay? And ultimately the way we think, the way we perceive, and the way we respond under pressure. Right? So regardless of whether you train with the sword regularly or you've never picked one up or whatever, right? If you make it to fall camp, live or virtually, whatever, okay, you'll leave this particular weekend, right, seeing your training through an entirely new lens. Okay, so give me a day or three to get the little blurb on our events page at onlineninjaacademy.com/events, and also the full information and registration page up. And if you're on the mailing list, you'll get an email. If you follow us or whatever on the different platforms, Facebook, Instagram, what else, YouTube, that kind of thing, hopefully you'll see one of the posts that go up. Okay, but again, mark your calendar. Right, it's October 16th, 17th, and 18th. We'll be right here at our main home booth here in East Central Pennsylvania. Right, and yeah, it'll be good. I can't wait. Okay, so that being said, let's get back to our regularly scheduled show. How about that? Right. So again, before we go any further, I think we need to clear something up. Right. I touched on this already, but I think this requires a little bit more. Right. One of the trends that I've noticed over the years Like I said, I've been doing this for a couple of weeks. Especially as martial arts have become more commercial, more sport oriented, right? Or maybe just more concerned with public perception, right? And that goes for ninjutsu too, right? What I've noticed is that people sometimes become uncomfortable with parts of the historical ninja tradition, right? Unless they're Naruto fans or they're, I don't know, right? But what I'm talking about is if the lesson involves a discussion about disguise, right? They try to explain it away. If it involves deception, they try to soften it. I've done this myself, right? If it involves manipulation, they immediately assume it must be unethical, right? Personally, I don't think that serves the art or the student very well, right? Because if we're going to study ninpo honestly, we have to begin by accepting the historical reality of what the ninja actually studied, right? And they studied disguise. They studied infiltration. They studied escape, right? They studied the theatrical arts. What that means is they studied how to move like, dress like, sound like, whatever, right? Middle-aged man, young man, woman, old man, woman, child, all kinds of stuff, right? Mannerisms, personal characteristics, all those kind of things, right? They studied methods of influencing what other people believe to be true, right? Why? Therein lies the question before we make a snap judgment. Why? Because their job wasn't to win tournaments. It wasn't to impress other martial artists. It wasn't to preserve tradition for future generations. Their job was to survive, to complete whatever mission they were on, right? To protect information and get it back where it was supposed to go, right? To protect people, ultimately to return home alive. And because the secrecy of the clan, because, you know, if you did during that period in history, if you didn't believe the same things that the people in power believed, well, they can come and just behead you. Okay. So the secrecy of the clan, right? The home front, where you lived, all that kind of stuff, that was sacrosanct, right? That was sacred. Right. So not only did I have to get back home alive, but I had to get back home alive where nobody else followed me. Nobody else knows, because if they followed me, then they followed me right back to the same people that I'm trying to protect, which is what a lot of modern fighters don't think about when they get into, you know, smack talking bullshit or whatever. And I don't care if it's professional fighters or if it's, you know, the drunks in the bar on Friday night or I don't care, right? Do they know? Can they find out where you live? Do they have to meet you on fair ground? No. Not from Budo's perspective. From a fair fight perspective. But Budo isn't about, typically, it's not about fair fights, especially Ninpo's perspective. Okay? And that's why the ninjas studied what they did, because they were already on the oppressed end. They were already on the losing end. Right? And when your life depends on accomplishing those things, anything that legitimately increases your odds of survival deserves to be studied. And that includes deception. That includes misdirection. That includes creating assumptions that work in your favor. Okay? Now, before anybody misunderstands where I'm going with this, there's an important distinction that we need to make. Okay? And that is that the principle itself, Kyojitsu Tenkan Ho, the principle itself is morally neutral. Every word in any language, vocabulary, right? Any action, whatever, right? They're morally neutral. Do you understand what that means? Okay? any things, right now we're speaking about Kyojitsu, right? Its ethical character, its ethical nature, standing, whatever, right, comes from the purpose for which it's used. It comes from the intention behind the act, not the act itself. Okay? Think about self-defense. Most of us would agree that hitting another human being is not something that we should be looking to do as a normal course of living. Yes, right? Okay? I hope, right? But if hitting an attacker is the only thing standing between us, an innocent person, and serious harm, we don't evaluate that action in the same way, right? Because context matters. The purpose matters. Intention matters. Right? And the same is true here. Right? A criminal deceives in order to exploit someone, right? A con artist deceives to steal. A manipulator deceives to control. Okay? But think about these other examples. A parent distracts a child who's about to run into traffic, right? Or in the middle of a temper tantrum, right? Might fall down a set of steps or whatever, right? An executive protection agent, right? Gently, subtly redirects a principal away from danger without creating a panic. Right? A police officer uses conversation to shift an armed person's attention away from hostages. Even a doctor, right? A doctor might do something, say something or whatever to calm a frightened patient, might, distract a child or whatever, right? Call the nurse in. The nurse is making googly faces at the kid, getting the kid to laugh, so they pop that shot in him, right? So no one would accuse those people of acting like criminals, right? The outward principle, the action, may look similar, but the purpose, the intent is entirely different. Yes? Okay. So as warrior protectors, our responsibility isn't simply to learn techniques. Okay? It's to understand principles deeply enough to use them in service of protection rather than for exploitation, for strong arm tactics, for bullying, whatever. Okay. And I think that's an important distinction, right? That needed to be made before we go any further. Okay? Because without good moral grounding, without personal clarity, without that Seishin Teki Kyoyo side of training, any of this stuff can be abused. Okay? And that's why I lean into the warrior perspective or the warrior protector identity and not just I'm learning stuff. Okay. Anyway, so let's get back to Kyojitsu Tenkan Ho, right? Imagine you're a complete beginner. I don't know who's on. I don't know who's listening. I don't know who might be listening in the future. If you are a complete beginner, well, then you don't have to imagine, right? But the higher you are in the ranks, the rank levels, the higher you see yourself from that position or whatever, okay? Sometimes it's a good idea to go back, right? Imagine you're a complete beginner, right? And someone tells you, I don't know, use a high feint. So he'll defend high and then attack low. Okay? Simple, right? Cut and dry. Right? Makes sense, right? It's obvious. It's easy to understand. Okay? Or maybe, we're looking at old ninja tactics, or I don't know, we might be training in these things, right? Throw a stone toward one side of the compound so the guards go check it out while you enter somewhere through the now unguarded gate. Okay? Again, obvious, large, visible. Okay? Also easy for people to go, well, duh, everybody knows that, and nobody would fall for it. People fall for this stuff all the time. Okay? Just because it looks or sounds obvious to us when we're sitting around a table Well, we'll talk about this as we go along. Okay. But the point here is that the beginner immediately understands what's happening, right? I distract him. I can get something else, right? That's the important lesson. Because up until that point, the beginner has probably believed that fighting is simply he attacks, I defend. He attacks again, I defend again. You know, typical slugfest everyone thinks is how it's done, right? You beat his ass, right? Okay. But that's where people tend to start. Not a problem unless he's bigger, faster, stronger, you're older, you're weaker, you're ill. Okay. I've actually heard, my daughter can attest to this because she just heard some tough guy, jiu-jitsu guy here not too long ago, contend that power was everything, and actually admitted that if he was being attacked, not in a fair fight, he was being attacked, and the other person was bigger, stronger, whatever, that his automatic assumption would be he's going to lose. And so, he's just going to hurt the guy as much as possible before he dies. That's his assumption, because his belief system is power's everything. Well, it's a good thing we're in Ninjutsu. Anyway, right? So, but anyway, that's a beginner mind kind of thing, right? So the first thing is, we get taught these little things, like if you put your hand up over here, you can kick him in the gut because he's not paying attention, right? So the first really great breakthrough is discovering that attention itself can be influenced. Okay. Now, we can study a whole bunch of techniques and see, well, I can distract him this way, I can distract him. Okay, yeah, I know. But this goes back to that question, right? Why does it work? It works because attention can be influenced. Okay? That's why any of these techniques work. Okay? Now, we're going to explore this for a minute, and then we're going to spend a little bit of time taking a look at some of that influence. But first breakthrough, first important piece is that someone's attention can be influenced. That, to me, is enormous. That is a huge leap ahead of just throwing shit and trying to duck shit and hoping that I can take more than he can before one of us gets our ass beat. Okay? For many people, that lesson is the first time they realize that conflict isn't just physical. The mind matters. Where someone is looking matters. What they expect matters. What they believe is happening matters. Okay? So the overt deception has already accomplished something much bigger, much larger than simply fooling another person. Okay? This lesson introduces the student to a completely different battlefield. Not just the body, but also the mind. Okay? And here's where I want to ask you another question. Okay? If I do the exact same distraction and one attacker chases it or falls for it or follows it, right? While the other doesn't, what actually determined the outcome? Right? Was it the distraction? Right? Was it the physical movement that I just did? Or was it something inside the person experiencing it? Think about that. Okay? Because the answer to that question is what transforms. It's what takes Kyojitsu Tenkan Ho from being just something from a collection of clever tricks, right? Ninja stuff, right? Into one of the deepest strategic principles in the entire art. Right? And I believe that's a doorway into the next stage of development. Right? There's always a next stage. All right. Questions, comments? James, anything? We're still coming through okay?
Yep, still sounds good. Jimmy
Okay.
stopped by. Said combo wall.
Who
Jimmy.
did? Oh, cool. Hi, Jimmy. That was it? Okay.
That's it.
Fine. I won't talk to you guys anyway. Wait, I am talking to you guys. Anyway, all right. So, all right. So, let's go back to that question, right? If two different people, experience exactly the same distraction, why does one fall for it and the other one doesn't? Right? Because at first glance, it seems obvious, right? One person was fooled, the other wasn't. Obvious, right? Okay, but I don't think that's actually what happened. Okay. Now, without going into a whole bunch of psych warfare and cognitive warfare and a bunch of other things that my daughter is way more specialized at than I am, I just know how to use the stuff. As far as explaining, she's much better at explaining things. Anyway, so, but let's imagine something, right? Suppose I fake a strike, like a punch, right, to your head, okay? At anybody's head, right? One person immediately raises their hands, right, to defend. Another one barely flinches. What changed? Was my movement different? Nope. Was the technique different? Nope. The only thing that changed was the person experiencing it. Okay. And again, immediately, instantly, Kyojitsu Tenkan Ho stops being about what I did and begins becoming about, wait for it, how another human being interprets what they see. That is another huge shift. Right? Because most people don't get past the physical trickery. I'm going to bob one side, throw, bob to the right, throw a left, whatever, right? But that is a profound shift. Because now we're no longer studying deception, are we? Now we're studying perception. We're studying attention. We're studying expectation. We're studying assumptions. In other words, we're studying human nature. And I believe that's exactly what the ninja were doing through the theatrical arts, the other related skills they used in this area, right? So again, yes, they learned disguises. They learned acting. They learned performance. But I don't think disguise was ever the deepest lesson. Okay? In fact, history shows us, the scrolls tell us that the ultimate goal was to become invisible in the eyes of the enemy. Right? That the Shichihode disguises, these 7 ways of going, right? That Metsubishi blinding powder, that other tactics were developed as expedients during a time in history when these ninja families had to crank out more and more operatives, right? Because there was such a demand. They had to crank these guys out before they could take the time needed to develop the higher level ability, right? So they developed tricks to accomplish the same goal, at least to some extent, right? But the disguise was the laboratory, right? If we study the disguises, it's one thing to go through the Shichihode, right? The 7 ways of going, and look at these 7 historical disguises that the ninja could use, right? And memorize them. It's something altogether different to understand Japanese society and understand how these 7 disguises would allow them to go virtually, not unnoticed, because people would see them, but unsuspected. They could literally move around and be invisible in plain sight. Okay? So, looking at it from this perspective, from where we are, right? The disguise is a laboratory. It's a place where we can explore principles and concepts. But in their time, when all these stories came out about, using blinding powder and all these exploits and whatnot, right? The disguise, it was an expedient, okay? Because they weren't at a level, or we're talking about a genin who, was in and out of territories and whatnot and needed something quick and expedient to use, as opposed to a jonin, right? The head person in the clan who lived in plain sight, in social circles and whatnot, as himself or herself. And nobody would have ever suspected. Right? I mean, think about Takuma Sensei. People didn't know that he was a ninja. His neighbors, his family, right? A few people who studied with him or got things over time and whatnot did, but like the masses, his area didn't know that he was the 33rd Grandmaster of the Togapare school until they read it in his obituary. That's interesting to me. Okay. So, but these things, right? Studying it, this allowed them to observe something timeless, right? So, disguise is yes and whatnot, but what makes the disguise work? What makes these other things work? Because again, I cover some of this in the book Seishin Teki Kyoyo, but these were some observant people. Like, if this is true, and this is true always, how can we use that, right? So this allowed them to observe something universal, right? And apply it at a workable level very quickly, okay? It allowed them to pay attention to a universal truth that says human beings don't simply respond to reality. They respond to the reality they believe they're experiencing. Okay? Think about that. Think about that. Human beings don't respond to reality. We respond to the reality we believe we're experiencing. That's not just a ninja thing from way back. That's been proven over and over again in multiple sciences. Okay? A disguise, in and of itself, has no power. A costume can't deceive anyone, right? If you saw one hanging on the rack at the store around Halloween time, you wouldn't be fooled into believing a person was there when it was just clothing, right? The bald guy's cap on the shelf, right, that you could buy, right? You wouldn't look at that and go, oh, that's literally the top of someone's skull, right? Somebody had been scalped. Okay? At least I hope not, right? So, two, right? A false retreat can't deceive anyone in and of itself. A kick feint or a lifting hand can't deceive anyone by itself. To the brain, those things are simply information for it to process. Okay? The deception doesn't happen in the disguise. It doesn't happen in the leg or in the hand. It happens in the observer. In this case, we're talking about the attacker, right? Again, I've been repeating this over and over again. This is a scientifically proven thing. Most people operate as though their brain is an objective observer, but it's not. It's an assumption-making machine. The human mind sees incomplete information and immediately begins completing the picture. That's why I use open loops all the time. That's why I embed certain things into descriptions and whatnot, right? It's not a manipulative trick to fool anyone. It's a way of communicating that causes the brain to latch onto it because it needs an answer. It needs to complete the picture. We all do it every single day, not just in combat. We do it in business or at work. We do it in relationships. We do it in leadership positions. We do it in parenting, even while driving down the damn highway. We constantly make decisions based on incomplete information. And most of the time, those assumptions serve us well. Sometimes they don't. And that's where Kyojitsu Tenkan begins to mature even more. Right? The beginner thinks, what? I'm learning how to trick him. The intermediate or developing student begins asking, what? Why did he believe it? Why does this work? Okay, that's a completely different question. And once you begin asking better questions, we talked about that in a recent episode, right? The art begins giving better answers. Okay, how else can this be done to do the same thing? Right? This is where the intermediate student is, right? Different options, different ways to do things, what some people call henka, right? What catches attention, especially in a fight, and what doesn't? What gets ignored, and why? Right? Otherwise, we just arbitrarily throw shit out there and hope that it works. But if we know why, we know when, we know the conditions that are necessary to make that work, or for it to almost work by default, okay, that changes. Okay. Now let's bring this back to your actual training. Okay. Think about some of the kata you've practiced, right? Take the kata Renyo, for example. Okay. It's the second kata on the Jodyaku no Maki first level scroll of the Gyoko school. Okay. Heavenly Palanquin, right? One of my coaching students recently asked a really great question. Okay. So she's working on this thing, right? And we just had this coaching thing, right? And she said, where does the attacker have to be for him to grab my lapel after he kicks and I parry that? Okay. Like, where does he have to be? Okay. And at one level, that's a technical question. But she's not at that level. Right? She already knows the technical stuff, right? Because technically, we're talking about distance. We're talking about position. We're talking about timing. Okay? There's nothing wrong with that. Okay? But what I realized was she wasn't really asking about the kata anymore. Okay? Because her question wasn't about where does she need to be, or where does the attacker need to be to do the grab, right? She was really asking the question, right, about herself, not where does the attacker need to land after the kick parry so that they'll actually want to reach out and grab. The question is, where do I need to be? And when do I need to be there so that when I disrupt his balance and he reaches out for something solid to grab a hold of, there I am. Okay? So where do I stand so Renyo works. Because if I disrupt his balance and I'm not in place for him to catch that thing, he's either going to collapse straight to the ground, or we're doing koku. We're doing the previous kata, which Renyo is just a what if next step. Okay? I parry it, he's stumbling or otherwise exposed, and I attack something that's open. That's koku. Okay? Renyo is like, what if I parry this thing and either the leg parry is weak, or it doesn't work, or he's a nimble little minx, right? Catches himself, catches his balance, and then reinitiates, and it's an actual physical attack, right? Or what if it is, and it's an oh shit moment, and he reaches out and grabs, okay? But even more than that, right? Where does he have to believe he is? What does he have to believe is possible? Not just consciously, but unconsciously, where his mind doesn't even question the obviousness of the thing, right? So I have to be positioned so that grab will happen when he has that little oh shit moment, right? But I could disrupt his leg, and I could be in range, and his arms just kind of flail. Okay, so now we're talking about influence, right? Because, and I think we talked about this in a recent, I don't remember if it was last week's KUDEN or it was Whiteboard Wednesday or whatever, right? How I used to think my teachers were nuts when they said this, but like I get it. I absolutely get it, right? When somebody grabs me, leave that hand right the hell where it is. Right? I don't need to get it off of me. It's not dangerous. Right? He might try to push me, might try to pull me, but that's why our kamae works the way it does, right? Him grabbing me, I know exactly where that hand is, unless he lets go with it, or lets go of it. I know exactly where it is, so I can access it for my use anytime I want. Okay? And he can't hurt me with it unless he lets go. So now the question is, either how do I need to execute the kick parry so it's not just a parry, so it causes him to flail in a certain way, and where do I need to be so that I'm right in the path of that arm or that hand that's looking for something to grab a hold of to not fall down. To me, that's cooler than shit. Now, that's an ability worth having. Okay? Because if I'm back in my old cop days, or I'm in security, bodyguard work or whatever, and I don't need to wrestle with this guy. What I need to do is parry him in a certain way so that I can redirect him to back up security or whatever and get back to my post as, guarding the principal, right? Then that's influence. Okay? It's not just another henka. It's not just another variation. It's not just another, oops, oh shit, he grabbed me, now what? Okay. Now, is that a perfectly viable question and a solution or a problem to be solved? Yeah, it's an intermediate problem to be solved. But she was asking was a question that, she's a Nidan and she's working on Sandan in our curriculum, the equivalent of 9th, 10th Dan in the old Bujinkan curriculum before the new Soke and whatnot started changing stuff. Right? So now we're studying Kyojitsu, right? This truth and falsehood, right? Now we're asking, what makes grabbing seem like the natural response? So natural, he doesn't need a conscious thought pattern to do it. What assumptions lead him there? What options does he think he has? What are the subconscious drivers, okay, that make somebody employ their arms in a certain way that reaches out and not up, not just close to the body or whatever, right? That make that flinch response naturally turn into something, and he didn't have to think about it. Okay. And also, what options have unknowingly disappeared without him noticing. Okay? I'm not saying it's just another way to do Renyo or whatever, right? What I'm saying is that's a very different way of studying a kata. Okay? Because if we can all agree that you're not duplicating the kata on the street, you're going to borrow bits and pieces of it, but those bits and pieces are all based on principles and concepts. Okay? This is strategic control and influence. Okay? If anybody wants to just memorize and duplicate kata, there are plenty of systems for that. Does that mean that we never memorize it? No, of course not. It's just not at this level. Kata are expedients. They're I've used the term before, laboratories. They're models for exploring how things happen, cause and effect, right? But at this point, we're no longer memorizing movement. We're studying decisions. We're studying perception. We're studying why human beings choose one response over another. Consciously, unconsciously, subconsciously, right? That realization begins changing everything again. I don't really mean that it's changing things. It's changing how we look at things. It's changing our perception, right? Because none of the other things went away, right? I can still do an overt distraction, right? I can still do things at the beginner, intermediate level, that kind of thing. It's not about that, right? But what I mentioned tonight during a class was we study things to recognize them, to understand them and whatnot, that most people don't even know are happening. That's where your advantage is. Because if you can see things and you can use things that the average attacker doesn't even know is going on, you're going to seem pretty freaking magical without setting out to be magical. Okay? But at this point, right, it changes things because we're starting to see Kyojitsu everywhere. It's not just in combat, right? Not just in theater arts, right? Not just in disguises, but inside kata, inside kamae, inside timing, inside distancing, inside rhythm, even inside silence, right? Even in non-action, choosing not to choose, those kind of things, right? That's why I said the trick was never the destination, right? The trick was simply the beginner's doorway, big model, right? Into seeing something much bigger, much broader, much deeper. Okay? The doorway to becoming that master and not just somebody who knows a lot of stuff. Okay? Now, there's another fascinating side effect that comes out of this realization. And this is where things get really deep. Okay? If Kyojitsu is really about understanding assumptions, deep level programming, then perhaps the first assumptions we need to examine aren't our attackers. Perhaps they're our own. Now, I say the first assumptions we need to examine, the first things after we recognize that assumptions steer choices. Okay? Because if we knew that was going on, then, well, why don't we just do this when we're a beginner? Because I can tell people these assumptions are operating and stuff, but if they can't see them until way downstream, when the distraction actually happens, then any talk about perception and assumptions and, hardwired beliefs or habitual responses and whatnot, it's all just theory. It's all just academic theory. We can't work with it until we've gotten through a bunch of these other things to where they just become easy to do. But we keep asking why. Keep asking why. Right? So again, we just keep going farther and farther upstream. Because now we're past the advanced student and we're into Tatsujin territory, master's territory. Right? Where everything gets flipped. Because to understand other people, we start here. Not because our perception or our perspective is the only one that's right. It's because the only one that we have direct access to and can explore all the time. Then, based on what we learn from that, we can start to branch out and look at other personality types and things like that, right? So again, maybe before we start studying somebody else's assumptions or second guessing people or whatever, we start with our own. But again, just as always, before we go there, right? Maybe something else. Okay. Before I jump into that, we're going to talk about a technique. I think I mentioned it earlier, right? There was something I was doing with students on Saturday, and it was technique training. It was absolutely technique training. Okay. James, any questions? Any comments pop up?
No, nothing yet.
No. All right. All right. So let's do this. Let's revisit something that many of you probably think you already mastered. Okay. And this is a simple wrist grab escape. Okay. It's a simple mod 1 wrist grab escape for my students. Right. Because I believe, and for those couple of students that were in class Saturday morning, I think I proved it. Right. Hidden inside that beginner lesson is everything we've been talking about so far, and perhaps everything we've been missing. Part of the problem is the assumption that, well, it's a beginner technique, so it's not advanced, and therein lies a problem, right? Because at least in my curriculum, the techniques in Mod 1 are not beginner techniques. My guys can answer this question already, right? They're not beginner techniques. They're techniques that we give to beginners. It's not the same thing. They're not given to them because of ease. They're given to them because they answer, all of them collectively answer one of the biggest questions and problems, which is, what am I most likely to be attacked by and with in today's world? And at least where we live, 95 to 98% of attacks occur in very specific ways. There's like half a dozen of them. So we give everybody at least 2, if not 3, techniques for handling each one of those. Okay. So let's talk about that, right? This beginner's wrist grab escape. Okay. I think we worked on a cross-side wrist grab escape. Okay. So there's a mod 1 way to do it, right? Just kind of step around. We've all done it, right? Come around, chop through the arm, get him off of you, move away into a better position, that kind of thing. There's a mod 2 way to do it, mod 3. But what we did was we didn't start with the grab escape. Okay. And again, if you trained with me through our foundations curriculum, you'll recognize this lesson right away, right? One of the first postures that I introduce to students is not a fighting stance. Okay. One of the first ones I introduce, of course, they're going to learn Ichimonji and Jumonji and Hira and all that, right? But the first one that I introduce them is what I call a fending posture, right? So one hand is held higher. It's kind of up here like in a stop kind of thing, right? Only trouble. And then the lead hand is lower, right? I'm going to have to lift it up here for those of you that are watching live, right? And the palm is facing down and it's patting the air, right? Implying what? Calm down. Hey, right? That kind of thing, right? Again, it's a fending action. Kamae are communication tools, okay? It's a fending action, okay? because we're starting off with de-escalation. I know a lot of people don't want to hear that because I'm studying martial arts so I can wipe the floor with his ass. Okay, fantastic. Okay, hope you don't end up in jail, and hope you don't have to worry about something else in your ass and whatever. Right? So de-escalation. I said and, not in. Right? So just so I'm clear. Anyway, so this de-escalation is one of the pre-attack phases in our 8 phases of effective self-defense strategy. Right? In that framework. Okay. So now at the beginner level, that's exactly what we're teaching. Right? We're teaching body language either from an Ichimonji-like thing or a Hira-like thing or this fending-like thing, right? So that students understand, right? Your body language should match your words, okay? If you're trying to avoid violence, then don't look like you're preparing to involve yourself in it, okay? In your head, you could be thinking, I'm defending myself. But if your body language is you know, if your mouth is saying, I don't want to fight, but your body's going, right? Don't be confused when shit doesn't go your way, right? But that in and of itself is good, solid self-protection. Okay? It's also a good legal strategy, right? Because if witnesses later describe the encounter, right, what do you want them to remember? Especially if you're trying to claim self-defense, okay? The person standing calmly or trying to calm things, that kind of thing, right? To dissuade the attacker or the person who looked ready to fight. Okay. So right from module 1, we're already working before the attack begins. Most beginners think that the attack starts when the fist or the foot or whatever is flying at them. Okay. But that's not the way reality works. Okay? The attack starts before weapons move. Okay? It starts with intent. It starts with identifying you as a target. Okay? So our defense has to start long before anyone grabs us, long before anyone throws a punch. Right? We're already moving through the early phases of conflict. Okay? And that's one of the reasons why our curriculum begins with students getting these 8 phases. Okay? Because real self-protection doesn't begin again when the fist starts flying, when the knife starts coming, right? It begins much earlier. Okay? Now, that's the beginner lesson, right? The beginner lesson is communicate, hey, I don't have any trouble, right? Because you're also influencing the minds and perceptions of witnesses and whatnot, right? You're trying to get this guy, hey, calm down, man, right? So that's the beginner lesson. Completely appropriate for beginner, completely necessary, right? But let's revisit that exact same posture from another level, just like we did this past Saturday, okay? Notice where that lead hand is, okay? And I know those of you on audio only, you're either going to have to look it up or you're going to have to use your imagination or whatever, right? But that lead hand is already occupying a very specific point in space between he and I. Okay? It's one of the rules of Totoku, right? The guarding blade, right? It's not about blocking or whatever. It's about keeping the weapon between you and him, okay? But it's in a very specific place. If the attacker chooses to grab, where's he most likely to grab? Exactly. The hand would just put right there in front of him, right? It's the easiest thing. Okay? So I've already given him something that the opportunistic mind, who either can't find another way in or whatever, and my position, bladed at a certain distance with this kind of thing, right? His hands up, right? Not just saying stop, but it's also in a guarding position and whatnot, right? I have done other things to him as well, okay? I've limited his options, that kind of thing, right? But notice the orientation of the palm, right? If you were patting the air like you were trying to tell a kid, hey, shh, calm down, right? Your hand probably wouldn't be in karate chop position, right? It's palm down, okay? No. And it's only right that most beginners think that's simply part of the gesture, right? Because it's authentic communication, That's the universal sign for calm down, shush. Okay, not hiya, right? Okay, so it's just body language. But again, beginners think it's just naturally a part of the gesture, right? The thing, right? And it is, but it isn't. Because that orientation of the arm in this position rotates the radial bone, the radius, and the ulna into a very particular relationship. Okay? Because normally the arms hang this way. When we're up and we're talking and we're working, the radial bone is up and the ulna is underneath it. We have to do things on the motorcycle or on the bicycle or running the lawnmower or whatever for them to be in a different orientation. The natural orientation is vertical, stacked. Okay? But what are we doing? We're putting our hand in a very specific position. Okay? Changes a lot of things. And the intermediate student starts learning, oh, okay. So when I put my hand in handshake position, or if my arm just happens to be out there, who knows, maybe I have a weapon or whatever, and he grabs this stacked orientation, if he's coming in to grab a low hand, even a high hand up here like this, okay? My hand's like this, and he comes in to grab. This is the narrow alignment relative to him, and it's much easier for him to get his hand around. It fits the hand better than this one. If my arms are up, my hands are up, my palms are facing out. I'm saying this for the folks on the audio only stuff. My palms are out. My radial bone and my ulnar are now side by side, just like they would be if I were down patting the air. Now the wrist is widest, and it's much harder for somebody to get their hand on there and wrapped around. It's not the same. It's not as easy, right? The way the hand is constructed and the way the wrist and forearm is constructed, it's not the same. Okay? So now imagine that someone grabs your wrist firmly, like they don't want you to go anywhere, like they're holding on to you or are about to manhandle you. Okay? Not the weak, unrealistic grabs we see in demonstrations. A real grab. Okay? In fact, when I teach this to my advanced students, just like I did this past week, right? I often begin by teaching gachi, right? These hook points on the body, okay? Just like there, right? At the wrist base of the hand, right? Because everything kind of flares out at an angle, right? That kind of thing. Just point up here behind the elbow, up behind the shoulder, behind the jaw. There's these points around, right? They're another detail within the study of Kyusho, what most people call pressure points, which is not only a bad translation, it's not even right. But, right, weak points. Okay. So what I end up doing is I show them how to grab the wrist-hand connection in a way that makes the traditional white belt escape when somebody just kind of grabs the forearm, grabs the wrist, right? I teach them how to grab that so it makes that escape almost impossible. Okay. The way it works for beginners. Okay. Why? Well, lots of different reasons. One, because I don't want anybody believing the escape works because the attacker has a shitty grab, right? I want students to understand that when the Bushido guys call BS, their perspective is BS. It's ignorant, and that's okay. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, right? Let these assholes think of whatever they want. Okay. Like they're not going to go study it anyway because they already think it's bullshit. See the assumptions. See all the things you don't have to worry about from certain people? Okay? No. I want these advancing students asking a different question. It's always a different question that leads to higher levels. The question is, if the grab is stronger, if he absolutely grabs me where, like, I can't do that mod 1 technique, but I need to get my hand free easily, right? If the grab is stronger, why does this still work? Okay. Now watch what happens, right? The defender doesn't suddenly become stronger. They don't wrestle harder. They don't overpower the grip. Instead, remember, it's a cross wrist grab, and I can't do a cross because I only have 2 arms, right? My partner reached across, okay, to grab. His thumb would be on my little finger side, and his 4 fingers would be over here. If you try to grab your own wrist, it's opposite. It's like a mirror side grab. It's a different one, okay? So his thumb's going to be on the little finger side, on the ulna side, and 4 fingers are over here, this way. And if I keep this at a certain level below his hands, unless he tries to come in and grab from the side, which means he did what? Well, what if he grabs you this way? Well, if he grabbed me that way, then he opened up his center. Why am I waiting? Why don't I just jack him in the throat? Okay, context, right? So if he's guarded and he's looking for an option, and I'm too far away to punch easily, or he's worried that if he reaches out to punch, I'm going to block, or maybe he's already reached out to do that, and I took that hand and popped up into his arm and hurt a couple of things, and now he has an even more reason to want to grab a hold of that freaking wrist so he can grab a hold of me and do something else to me. Fantastic, okay? So now he's grabbed this, okay? And what they're going to do is they're simply going to relax the muscles that were maintaining this palm down position and let this happen in his hand. Now, you have to try this with partners because 4 students on Saturday, and we were cranking down on each other. And the forearm, because when people grab, unless they know how to grab the bone structure itself, what most people do is they grab the meat sack. He doesn't have the bones. My ulna and radial bone are shifting in position this way, right? So the forearm naturally returns toward its stronger skeletal alignment. Nothing dramatic. They don't do more. They actually do less. No explosive movement, no special trick, just structure. All right? The very posture we adopted to communicate peaceful intentions as a beginner was already preparing our body to become stronger if the grab occurred. Okay? Now think about what just happened. Did we become stronger after the grab? No, we were stronger before the grab. Okay? What we did was made sure that the important work had already been done. The deception, the Kyojitsu, was that there was nothing strong about my wrist. It wasn't, he's grabbed how many people before and was able to manhandle them. Okay? The deception maybe wasn't even something that I was doing. Okay? But, like I said, for us, the important work had already been done. Long before the attack, long before the technique, long before the escape. Okay? Now let's keep going with that. Same posture. Still communicates peaceful intent. Still supports de-escalation. Still helps shape witness perceptions. Still places our body in position where defense becomes easier. Right? All those beginner and intermediate lessons remain absolutely true. We haven't replaced them. None of that has changed. We didn't drop this into a box, slide it into a closet so we could play with new toys. The capabilities of a technique that most people dismiss as a beginner technique is now through the roof. Okay? We haven't replaced them. None of that has changed, right? We've simply discovered another lesson, another layer that was just quietly, subtly waiting inside the first one. We didn't have to add anything to it, didn't have to take anything away from it. What we had to be able to see was, right, that it was there. Now, let's go back to this intermediate stage again, okay? So again, notice a trend, right? Across not just what I've been talking about here, but if you follow along with the episodes, right? Last bunch of episodes, right? We started talking about these stages, and how they're not about increasing complexity, right? Not increasing complexity of technique, but rather increasing capability, right? And often, not by doing more, by doing less. Okay. So as the student progresses through the curriculum, they begin learning different strategic modes, right? Long range weakening of somebody who's bigger, stronger, that kind of thing. Close range jamming, evasive repositioning, controlling structure, different forms of tehodoki, these hand releases, right? Different methods of using leverage, different ways of creating kazushi, balance breaking, right? Those become additional options. Nothing from module 1, nothing from this base disappears. Everything remains. We don't leave behind the techniques. We explore and develop ways of doing them easier, quicker, under different circumstances. Okay? I've said this before, and I'll continue to say it. There's only so many things you can do with a human body to another human body. Can't find anything in our martial art that isn't in other martial arts other than the approach and the perspective. Okay. At this stage, the student simply has more ways of expressing the same underlying principles. Okay. So let's revisit the beginner posture one more time, right? This time, the question changes again. Okay. We're no longer asking the beginner question, how do I escape the grab? We're asking, what have I already done that makes him weaker if he chooses to grab? Again, that's a completely different question. Right? If I stand in Shizen, he can grab sleeve, he can grab my throat, he can grab me by the face, grab lapel, he can try to tackle me. But as soon as I take up that fending position, I start affecting perception, decisions, assumptions. Okay, and if I've studied different fighter types and different styles and those kind of things, the way he's holding his hands, the way he's posturing, tells me already what position to take up. Because we have techniques also for trying to calm him down this way. Hey, calm down, man. Relax. Okay? But that funnels his perspective. Right? Because if he's already, chances are he's not grabbing anything. So my position now, he might grab. So we've got techniques for that just in case. But if he doesn't, he's going to have to go through something, which is going to be more difficult, but we can move, right? He's going to have to go around it, or he's going to have to go under it. And if he goes under it, it's either going to be a punch or a kick. See, options get narrowed. Okay. So what have I already done that makes him weaker if he chooses to grab? Okay. So now we're not studying techniques. We're studying conditions. Grab hasn't even happened yet. The technique hasn't even happened yet. But we've already influenced the relationship. That was one of the most startling lessons I got from a teacher a long time ago. That a fight is a relationship. Because most people, when they hear the word relationship, they think intimate, they think friendship, they think nice. But we are relating in a negative way, but we are relating. It's a relationship. Okay? We've already improved our structure. We've already increased our options. We've already reduced some of his. Okay? Interesting, right? And perhaps to me, one of the most fascinating parts is that he still believes he's making a free choice. That, ladies and gentlemen, is Kyojitsu. I was taught a long time ago, still a white belt, that a ninja takes control from the opponent, from the attacker, long before that person ever realizes that he lost it. It's not just academic, it's not just theory, right? Our techniques, our kata are showing us exactly how that's done in different ways, under different contexts, right? So then think about the attack that's supposed to be coming. Right? Now, if everybody always practices like they're a rank beginner and they're always doing ski, right? This start way back here, we attack in here, right? Because that's how everybody attacks out on the street where you live, right? Okay. It's a perfect beginner lesson. But if that's where we're staying, no wonder people can't translate their kata right. Because it's a first step. It's not the only step, right? And lots of kata, not these bullshit kata descriptions that have been passed around since the mid to late 80s, right? Where they literally sat down with these videos that were coming out, right? And they just translated them, uke ski, tori, do X, Y, Z, finish, whatever, right? They were just transcribing action on a freaking video screen or a demo they remembered or whatever. But that's not the translation of what's in the scrolls. Sometimes it is, but other times it isn't. Okay, we talked about koku in the past, right? Koku, like, how do you come up with the standard model out of that description? Right? Anybody can check me on this. Okay, if you have what the hell's that book? It's not the Complete Ninja. It is the Samurai and their Fighting Arts or something like that, right? The Fighting Arts of the Samurai. So Hatsumi Sensei's book, right? And it has the select techniques and whatnot from the actual scrolls of a bunch of the lineages, right? And see the English, but if you go over, he left the Japanese in there. Here's the Japanese description of the kata. Doesn't say the same thing. Okay. The enemy attacks your face, not the uke. Uke and an enemy. Uke and teki are completely different people. Okay. So the enemy comes at your face. They attack your face. They attack your men, which is anywhere here, right? Uke and, right? Uke, not uke nagash, not uke dome, not uke uchi. Uke means to receive. How? Doesn't say. Well, how is he attacking you? Is he throwing a straight punch, hook punch, uppercut? What? The point of the lesson is, if you know this and you're doing it right, it doesn't matter, because all fists will come into this space. All attacks will come into this space. So the kata is saying he attacks this space. So I need to be in a position, in place, in time, to where all of his attacks will come in here. Too close, and he can hook around and hit the side of my head. Well, that's fucked, right? If I'm too closer than that, he can grab a hold of me and jack me with something like that. So those descriptions are written by a master who wrote them as reminders to either other masters or people that were on the path who would be receiving a model or an example or whatever as the KUDEN, to start making sense of, how do I accomplish what that says? Because it doesn't say uke nagash or anything. It says uke and break the stars of his arm. Well, shit, now I need to know Kyusho, because it says Hoshi, points, stars, weak points, right? Doesn't say where, doesn't say how. Yeah. Interesting, I think, right? So, again, we started controlling this person's options. We started taking away options. We started doing all these things, right? Not because we hypnotized him, not because we forced him, not because we manipulated his mind. There's no woo-woo, right? But because we understood something about human behavior, and that is, given certain conditions, human beings naturally tend toward certain responses. We didn't remove his freedom. We simply prepared for the responses most likely to emerge, most likely to happen if he does XYZ. And based on my posture, our alignment, whatever, he only has so many options to choose from. Not infinite. Like I said, maybe 3. That's strategy. That's Kyojitsu. Okay, I get it. The beginner's worried about not getting hit, getting them off of them as quickly as possible, right? The intermediate person is learning different ways to do that, but their concern is what? How do I get this guy on the floor? How do I finish this thing? Whatever. Okay? The advanced person at other advancing levels, very different, right? Very different. And now here's the part that this is what really gets me. This is what really, like, I don't get excited by much. This gets me jazzed, right? Everything I just described was already sitting right there inside that quote unquote beginner technique, that beginner lesson. Nothing was added. I didn't change anything for the intermediate advanced students. Wait, I take that back. I did change one thing. Anybody remember what it was? I increased the pressure they had to deal with. I made the uke grab hard. And I made the uke, I gave them permission to stop the defender at the first sign of anything. Anything. First flinch, first movement, first twitch, anything, they could grab even harder. Okay? Because advanced people should be able to get out of tougher situations more easily, not expend more energy than a beginner to make shit look more complicated. Okay? The advanced lesson wasn't invented later. It wasn't some secret henka. It was embedded there from the very beginning. Right? The only thing that changed was the student's ability to see it. And I think that is one of the most important lessons in all of Ninpo. Because once you understand that, you stop asking, what's the next technique? And you start asking something far more powerful. Right? What haven't I seen yet in the things I already have? Where could I be closer to master's level with what I already have and stop confusing quantity with quality? Right? That's when real development begins. Okay? Because the greatest lessons are often hidden inside the techniques we believe we've already mastered. This art has shown me that over and over and over and over again. And like I said, I've been in this art since late 1980, early 81. So a couple of weeks. Okay. I'm going to keep going here. We'll open it up to questions here in just a bit. All right. So now I'd like to suggest something that may be a little uncomfortable. Okay. I've hinted at it. I've alluded to it. But we spent the first part of this episode talking about the attacker's assumptions, right? How people interpret incomplete information, right? How they make decisions, how they create a picture of reality in their own minds. But what if the first person we need to understand is ourselves? Because I don't think Kyojitsu Tenkan Ho only explains conflict. I think it also explains learning. Okay? Let me explain what I mean. How many times have you heard someone say, oh, I already know that kata, right? I've already learned Omotengyaku. I've already done that wrist escape. I remember a student gets so frustrated, right? We'd work on that same technique I was just talking about. He's like, oh my God, if I got to do that one more time, I'm going to scream. Because he just had this assumption that because he knew it and could do it, that he knew everything about that needed to be known. It's just collecting techniques. Okay? You know, just heard people in Japan, right? I've seen Hatsumi Sensei teach Koku before, right? Noguchi Sensei, Nagato Sensei, we're just doing Koku again, right? So the question now is, like, when the teacher taught it and they recognized it, did they find a training partner and try to do what the teacher just did? Or did they do what they always do and tried to slip in a little extra trick that they saw Sensei do? I don't know, right? People say all kinds of things, right? Maybe you even caught yourself saying those words or ones like it, right? Maybe, right? I remember myself saying shit like that, right? Now, let me ask you something. Let's say we're talking about Koku or Omotengyaku, whatever, right? Whatever the technique is, right? Did you really know it? Or did you simply recognize it? Because we can recognize something. We can recognize somebody and say, oh, I know that thing. Or, oh, I know her. Right? But do you? Okay? Because knowing something, really knowing something, and simply recognizing it so you can identify it, label it, and get on with your day, those are very different things. Recognition is not understanding. Familiarity is not mastery. Repetition, no matter how many times you have repeated the same kata, is not depth. And certainty is not the same thing as seeing, perceiving. Okay? You ever see something really cool, like a tree or whatever, right? I love nature, right? So I'll go, man, check that tree out, right? And somebody will look at me and go, and they'll just barely glance at it and they go, dude, it's a tree. You've seen one tree, you've seen them all. So they're never going to see what I'm looking at because to them, all trees look alike. So they're never ever going to look at that tree unless it does something that seriously catches their attention. But now it's not about the tree, it's what the tree's doing. So they're still never going to look at the tree. That's what people do to kata all the time. Right? And I've mentioned this before, but one of the lessons Hatsumi Sensei returned to over and over again was that students always wanted the next technique. They'd barely begun exploring one kata, and they already wanted another one, right? Different throw, different lock, different weapon, something new. And I get it. We teachers demonstrate multiple techniques and all that kind of stuff, right? And part of it is like you need a broad base of answers that you can work on and get better at because who knows what the bad guy's going to throw at you. I get that part. But the other part, the part that I still have to account for when I do up a lesson plan for a camp or a class or whatever, is because ego bores easily, and it needs to be entertained. So here's a hanka, but sometimes the teacher does that, especially when Hatsumi Sensei did it or Nagato Sensei does it or whatever, and they're just stacking this stuff. You barely have 30 seconds to 2 minutes to work on something they just gave you. They call you back and show you another thing and another thing and another thing, right? What they're trying to do is overwhelm ego's attempt to classify everything or to crystallize things into a form, so you can get the feel, you can get the presence, you can understand why the principles are what they are, and how no matter how many times he changes it, you're still doing the same thing. Nagato Sensei has said, if you master one technique, you master them all. Not because they're all the same, right? But because they're made of the same principles. And if you learn how to look and you learn how to see, then you're going to look and see what's in that one, how that one's doing things. You're going to graduate past the step-by-step very quickly, right? But when I first heard him say that years ago, right, I think I interpreted it the way most people do, right? Or most people probably do, right? I thought he meant that all techniques are basically the same. But again, I don't believe that's what he meant anymore. I think he was talking about something much deeper. If you truly understand how to study one technique, how to uncover the principles inside it, how to recognize timing, distance, relationship, structure, assumptions, conditions, right? Then every new technique becomes another opportunity to discover those same techniques, to peel away the layers and figure out how this technique is doing stuff at the beginner level, at the intermediate level, at the advanced level, at the senior level, at the Tatsujin level, right? And at that point, you're no longer collecting techniques, right? You're not. You're refining perception. Right? Now think back to the mod 1, that wrist grab thing we just discussed, right? How many years could someone practice that lesson without ever noticing the structural advantage already built into the posture? How many times could someone escape the grab without ever asking why that particular hand position was chosen to begin with? Right? The beginner's like, you show them the trick that like the thumb's the weakest point in the hand. Between that and the gap that might be there, right? That's your weak point. Cool, right? But what makes it the weak point? What makes it so that I can, instead of doing extra to break free, what makes it so when I relax my arm, I can now, like, he can still be holding on to me, and I can reach for a sidearm and bring it out, and the escape will happen with no effort, no issue, no problem. If you don't believe me, ask one of the 4 guys that were in class on Saturday. And we were cranking down on each other, like, almost Indian burns. Okay? So again, how many times before they see that they've eliminated all but maybe those 3 options that he has left, right? And position themselves so that it doesn't matter what he throws. That what looks like a passive victim's posture looks like an attempt to de-escalate because the person really doesn't want to fight, right? How long is it going to take before they see that not as a passive victim's posture, but actually as a master's control of space, perception, access, and choices? I don't know. I know how long it took me. But how many people would simply say, "That dude, that's just the way Sensei does it," right? Oh, Sensei's a sneaky guy, right? It's the feeling. It's just the feeling, right? Or like I did that for my white belt, yellow belt, blue belt, whatever, right? I did that and move on, right? The technique never changed. The students simply stopped asking questions, or they weren't guided by an instructor who understood the process, who told them, like, why do you keep doing the technique the same way, right? What's different? Huh? What have you noticed? What do you notice today about that same thing, right? What do you notice when it happens that you didn't notice yesterday or last week or last month? Because if you're still noticing the same things, growth has not taken place. Accumulation might be taking place because I'm collecting more techniques, but I don't understand this one any better. And that here's where I think it becomes personal. Okay. Over the years, I've known many martial artists who eventually just stopped training. I'm sure you do too. Okay. Sometimes they change styles. Sometimes they stop going to Japan, right? Because it all looked the same. Sometimes they stopped attending seminars. Sometimes they left martial arts altogether. They just quit, right? And if you ask why, right, the answers often sound familiar, right? Again, life got busy, work took over, whatever, right? Money became tight, honey won't let me, whatever, okay? Now, all those things are real, right? I've experienced them myself, right? Many of you have as well, okay? But here's a question that I would highly encourage every serious martial artist to ask. Not to judge yourself, but to understand yourself more honestly, right? Here we are out there trying to judge and understand people trying to beat, break, or kill us, and we know very little about ourselves. Okay? But again, to understand yourself more honestly. If none of those things had happened, would you still be training today? I mentioned it earlier, right? If work had remained easy, would you still be training? If your spouse had encouraged you instead of put up a fit or whatever, would you still be training? Would you have taken time off? If life had stayed simple, would you have remained in training? Okay? If the answer is absolutely, then perhaps those things really were the primary obstacles. But if your answer is no, or I'm not sure, then perhaps those circumstances didn't create the decision. Right? Maybe they simply gave you the permission to walk away from something you'd already begun believing you understood. Okay? That's something worth thinking about. Okay? Because I believe that's one of the greatest demonstrations of Kyojitsu Tenkan Ho you'll ever encounter. This is Tatsujin level shit. Okay? People say they want mastery level stuff. Maybe we need another variation of our t-shirt. We've got a t-shirt that says everybody wants to be a black belt, so it's time to do black belt shit. We have another one that says everybody wants to be a ninja, till it's time to do ninja shit, right? Maybe we need one that says everybody wants to be a master, till it's time to do master shit. Who knows? But I think one of the greatest demonstrations of Kyojitsu Tenkan Ho that you'll ever encounter is in recognizing that it's not something your attacker did or somebody else did. It's not something your instructor did. It's not something your training partner did, right? It's something your own certainty did to you without your knowing it, without recognizing the effect that the assumption, I know this, I have time, they will never leave me, somebody can't distract me, nobody would ever grab my wrist in a fight, whatever. Okay? Because the reality is, whatever that assumption is, that assumption became the illusion. Not because anybody lied to you, not because anyone manipulated you, because your own mind reached a conclusion and then stopped looking. Not just for techniques, right? But ways to figure out a way to keep training, right? So that's what I'm saying. If we understand how it works on us, how we do this stuff to ourselves, not to judge ourselves or whatever, right? To understand what's going on the inside, because you're never going to get inside somebody else's head. To understand how the process works in his head, I need to understand how it works on me. How not having control of the process causes me to make decisions, make assumptions, see things a certain way and whatnot. Once I get that, oh, he's screwed. And once you can see it, you can't unsee it. And you see it everywhere. I do. The deception and manipulation, the people think they're really slick. It's wow. And the amount of it and the level of it. What's really funny to me, here's an irony. Here's an ironic thing, right? Most people hate to be sold to. Most people don't want to be approached by a salesman. Most people hate the sales pitch or whatever. But practically every person on this freaking planet is a salesperson, or a salesman, saleswoman, whatever, right? And they're actively engaged in sales tactics all the time. Every time they spin a story to convince somebody to do something that they want them to choose or they want to do, but they want the other person to think it was their idea, whatever. That's a sales pitch. We're trying to get them to buy something. It's just not a physical object and we're not getting money for it. Once you make that breakthrough, this all changes. And it changes more than any of the other levels could make a change. And once you start operating at this level, all of the other deceptions all the way down become more inevitable. They work 99.9% of the time and not on somebody and not on somebody else, because you don't try to do the same freaking distraction on everybody and then hope for the best. The thing that you do works on that person because you're noticing so much more. You'll stop doing shit just because it's the only thing you know, and you stop doing shit just to see if it'll work, and you stop doing shit that just looks obvious to people, right? Wow. Okay. And this is why two students can stand in the exact same class, watch the exact same demonstration, hear the exact same words. One person walks out saying, Sensei didn't show anything new. And the other one leaves saying, I can't believe what I just saw. Holy shit. How did I miss all that over all these years or months or weeks or whatever? Okay. So the difference wasn't the technique. The difference wasn't the teacher. The difference wasn't even the lesson. Right? The difference was the assumptions that each student brought into the room to begin with. And this is not just a martial arts thing. This is a life thing. Right? But just on the martial arts side, one of these students came in looking for a new technique. Didn't see anything because, well, I've seen all those. Okay? The other one came in looking for a deeper understanding. One recognized movement and said, I know what that is. The other one recognized principles and said, I never looked at it that way. Shit, I need to explore that. Yeah? Again, that's why I believe that Kyojitsu Tenkan Ho isn't merely a strategy for dealing with attackers. Okay? This is also one of the greatest mirrors ever handed to a martial artist. Because sooner or later, it asks each of us the same question. What have you become so certain about that you've stopped seeing what's really there? And as Soke often said, again, right? Not just a good martial arts lesson. That's a good life lesson. Okay? So where does all this lead? Where does all this lead, right? If Kyojitsu Tenkan Ho begins with deception and matures into understanding perception, what does it eventually become? For me, I mentioned this earlier, it becomes the study of human nature. Not because the theatrical arts disappear, not because deception suddenly becomes wrong, not because we abandon the historical teachings. Quite the opposite. We finally begin understanding what those historical models were trying to teach us from the very beginning. So in our attempt to modernize things, we don't throw shit away that can actually help us be better. We understand how to use it in a modern context. It's not the same, right? The disguise was never just about the disguise, but we can use a disguise if the context fits. I used to be a private investigator. Context fit, right? The feigned retreat, right, was never just about running away. But the better I can make it look like that's what I'm doing, the better it works when I come back. The distraction, right, is never just about making someone look in the wrong direction, even though it absolutely does. It's about knowing what to do to get that person to look in the wrong direction. Okay? Those were the large teaching models. And still workable tactics if needed. But the mistake isn't in learning them or not learning them, right? I think the biggest mistake is dismissing them, because then, but ignorance is bliss, right? If we dismiss them, then we never know what we're missing. Whatever, right? But if we're going to train them, the biggest mistake is thinking it's the only thing. We become a one-hit wonder, right? These things are a thing, but not the only thing. Not the end-all to beat-all killer ninja moves, right? People think they understand Kyojitsu Tenkan Ho because they just think it's distraction, right? And that's okay at certain levels, right? The beginner needs them to be obvious, just as a beginner needs large movements in Kyonapo. Just as a child first learns to write large block letters before eventually developing a flowing signature years later, right? The model doesn't disappear. The student's relationship with the model changes. Okay? And now the same thing happens with Kyojitsu, right? The beginner studies tricks. The developing student studies why the tricks work. Right? The advanced student, the advanced practitioner studies assumptions. The Tatsujin studies conditions. But somewhere between the advanced person and the Tatsujin level, they're understanding how that works and how we do it to ourselves all the time. How are we led to assumptions? What are the conditions that allow for that? Trust, loyalty. Let's see. I've learned a bunch of stuff and my rank is this high, so I automatically have the advantage. There's any number of these things, right? But either way, through all that transcendence and transformation, notice how the focus keeps moving farther upstream, right? Less attention on the visible movement, more attention on the causes that produces it, that allows it to occur, right? The reasons that it works. And again, I can't say that it's enough. Once you begin seeing that, you begin seeing Kyojitsu everywhere, not just in the martial arts class, not just everywhere. Okay? Not because you're trying to manipulate people, because you recognize that people are constantly interpreting the world around them. It's what we do, right? Supervisor walks into a room and instantly forms an impression. A customer decides whether they trust the salesperson before that salesperson has even finished introducing themselves, right? An attacker begins making decisions long before the first punch is thrown, even within our own families, right? Our relationships, our businesses, our jobs, right? Our students. People are constantly constructing a reality from incomplete information. Understanding that doesn't make us manipulative. It makes us more responsible. Because as warrior protectors, we have a choice. We can ignore that reality, stick to fair fights, fair play, whatever, or we can understand it deeply enough to use it ethically in the service of protection. And that's a very different mindset than simply learning how to fool somebody. Okay? And if we bring that back to something I mentioned earlier, right? One of the areas of study within the Ninja no Hachimon, right? The eight gates of authentic ninja training from way back in the day, right? Is the Ninja no Uge, right? Historically, this included many of the theatrical arts and things like that, the entertaining arts and whatnot that we've been discussing, right? Disguise, performance, influence, creating false impressions, all that kind of stuff, right? Again, those things are authentic. They're part of the historical record, okay? But viewed through the developmental lens we've been exploring, those arts become something much larger, much bigger, right? They become laboratories for studying human perception itself. Right? Again, not because the disguise matters, but because the disguise reveals something about the observer. And that's a very different way of approaching the subject. Okay. And interestingly enough, I eventually found that same developmental pattern again in my Mikyo studies. The beginner sees practices. The developing student begins seeing principles. And eventually, those principles become ways of understanding ourselves, our relationships, and reality itself. The forms never disappear. Our vision expands, which is one of the reasons I've often quoted that ending of the Heart Sutra, right? It's one of the teachings from Mikyo, which ends with the mantra, Gate, Gate, Paragate, Parasamgate, Bodhisvaha. For anybody that can do Pali and Sanskrit. No. It means gone, gone, gone beyond, gone completely beyond awakening or enlightenment. Just whatever we think that definition of that thing is, whatever we think knowing is. This is one of Shrey Sensei's things. A little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. Right? Pretty soon you're so freaking far ahead of what other people are seeing. Not that it's a contest, not a contest. Okay? But that's where we get the advantage. Right? Notice that it isn't talking about arriving somewhere and stopping. It's describing continual transcendence, continual transformation. Every time we think we've arrived, there's another horizon, another level of understanding, another layer waiting to be discovered. Right? I think authentic ninjutsu has always worked the same way. Okay? One of my teachers used to compare it to the horizon. No matter how far you walk, the horizon never gets closer. Some people hear that and get discouraged. I hear something completely different. Right? What I hear is, if your eyes remain fixed on the horizon and you keep walking, look how far you'll go. And that's the point. Not reaching the horizon, not being done, right? Becoming the kind of person who continues walking toward it. And that's also why it's important to look backwards every once in a while too, right? So you can see just how far you've traveled, right? And maybe that's the reason that Hatsumi Sensei could spend decades returning to the same kata, okay? That the master instructors keep repeating the same forms. Not because there's nothing new to teach, not just because there's a different group of students in Japan every week or two, right? But because there was always another horizon, always another lesson, always another way of seeing. And we didn't need a bunch of other kata to see it, right? And again, maybe that's why Nagatsu Sensei could honestly say, if you master one technique, you've mastered them all. Not because all techniques are identical, because you've learned how to keep seeing. You've learned how to continue discovering. You've learned how to avoid becoming trapped by your own certainty. Huh? So this brings me to something I'd like you to think about this week as you train, right? Whether it's a kihon, a kata, a sanshin movement, or even something you've practiced for decades, right? Don't ask yourself, do I know this, right? Or, what do I know about this or whatever, right? Instead, ask, what lesson might still be hiding inside of this? If you've been following KUDEN for the last couple of episodes, I've walked everybody through. Here's how a beginner shows up, and here's the questions they have. Here's what intermediates go through, right? The what ifs, the what ifs, the what ifs. Here's how it's the same process, right? Okay? That single question may change your training more than the next 100 techniques ever could. Okay? All right. So before we finish, I want to leave you with a preview of what we're going to be doing next. Okay. So this week's Warriors Whiteboard Wednesday is going to take this exact developmental model and apply it to something every Bujinkan student practices. The Sanshin no Kata. Oh my God, Sensei. Jesus Christ, do I have to do it again? Yeah. From the perspective of the Kyojitsu Tenkan. We're We're going to look at the Kyojitsu Tenkan Ho and the Sanchi no Kata. And we're going to look at where it shows up for beginner, where it shows up for intermediate, yes. Most people think of the Sanchin as basic movement training. Okay. And I think that those kata quietly walk us through the same developmental journey we've discussed today. From the obvious to the subtle, from movement to influence, from technique to human nature. Okay. And if something in a discussion sparks something in you, if you found yourself recognizing that there really are deeper layers waiting inside familiar lessons, then you might also enjoy exploring some of the resources I've created around those higher stages of development. Okay? James, I don't know if you can quickly grab the links and stuff, but the Ninja Mind program explores many of these strategic and perceptual principles in much greater depth. The first 7 steps on the path of a Buddha examines the developmental process from the Mikyo perspective. But either way, either of these ones, right? They show how transformation isn't about collecting more information. It's about changing the way we perceive ourselves and the way we're looking at the world and the way assumptions and expectations about things they're the things that are driving, right? Because in the end, perhaps the greatest lesson hidden inside Kyojitsu Tenkan Ho isn't about deception at all. Right? It's about learning to see ourselves more honestly, to see others more clearly. Hatsumi Sensei talked about this, right? There was a whole period where he was talking about just getting this stuff down so much that you can live like a normal person. You can live like an ordinary person. You can look like an ordinary person. But all this understanding under the surface makes you extraordinary. People think that extraordinary is what you end up looking like, the car you drive and whatnot. You look like everybody else, but you don't see and operate like everybody else. In Mikyo, the way this is described is being in the world, but not of the world. Right? It's about learning to see. Like I said, seeing ourselves more honestly, seeing others more clearly, to see principles where we once only saw techniques, right? And to recognize that the greatest illusions we will ever overcome are often the ones that we've unknowingly created ourselves and bought into. All right. So that's what I got. James, questions, comments, complaints? How do we wrap this up? I mean, I know how to wrap it up, but anything?
It's like, I believe it's Reg from Australia. A little bit back said, never punch or kick, open palm slaps. Everybody has a cell phone camera. Don't be ego-driven, stay legal at all times.
Yeah. We give that to new students and stuff, but I don't know, man. I think intermediate people, they tend to forget the legal side because they get all caught up in the takedowns and the lockups, and ooh, that's the cool thing. And, that's okay. People will wake up to certain points on the framework at certain times, and they realize that. Okay. Like I remember one time thinking about like. This whole good guy, bad guy kind of thing, because when we look at it, right, Uke and Tori, and right, we automatically assume that the defender is, they're the good guy, right? They're the righteous one. Yeah, makes sense. Okay. And we're doing what to the bad guy? These techniques are doing things to another human body way worse than most attackers would ever try to do. But see, it's different, Sensei, because we're morally, we've got the moral high ground. Yeah, okay. You can take the moral high ground all you want. just know where your legal standing is when you do those things, because your moral high ground is not going to keep you out of prison. And there's way more attackers in there surrounding you than there are, like, and I get it. What is it? If you live in the city on any given day, you've probably walked past or maybe even bumped into, what's the last number I just saw, or driven by or got stuck in traffic with. I think the statistic is 17 people that have a criminal record, are physically aggressive, are potential attackers, have a background in violence. Like, wow. Glad I live in a small town, so maybe it's only 7. So anyway, so cool. Yeah, remember the legal stuff, because that's, again, it's another one of those assumptions, right? The assumption of rank. I learned all this stuff. I have this rank, right? I have the advantage in an attack. Not if he shoots you in the face from across the street. Okay, so anyway, anything else, James?
No, sir. That was it.
All right. Well, in that case, that's another one in the history books. This week, again, Sanshin Kyonopo. Next week, for KUDEN, unless something changes, we're going to talk about why copying the master will not make you a master. We'll leave it at that. All right. For those of you who are my local students and whatnot, I will see you in class this week. If you're in my online programs and stuff, well, I'll see you in class this week as well. Don't forget, if you are local and you're or you're in the long distance stuff, no classes tomorrow. Tomorrow is test night at the academy, so there will not be a coaching call. There will not be, and it's a bridge week anyway, so there won't be coaching calls this week anyway. But yeah, there won't be a Ninpo master class because there's no Shinobi Kai class. We'll pick it up on Friday. All right. So that's it. Thanks. I appreciate it. We'll see you next time on KUDEN.